Unfortunately, the disciples had been blinded by that thinking. Or maybe they were blinded by their own ambition, trying to impress Jesus, that they knew what was in the Jewish mind. So they asked this question: Rabbi, you see that blind guy over there? Who sinned? This man or his parents that caused him to be born blind? Here's the guys. They've watched Jesus heal people. They've watched Jesus bring sight to blind. They've watched Jesus touch mouths and the mute were able to talk. They've watched him do all these miracles. And I want, as one of the bystanders in the crowd, I want the disciples, the followers of Christ, the ones who should have known better, I want them to step up and say, Jesus, there's a guy blind. You can touch him and you can make him whole. But what do they say? Jesus, there has to have been some sort of sin in that man's life or in his parents' life, and we want to know whose it was. And Jesus doesn't say it. I know he doesn't say it. But I think there was at least a look from Jesus that said to them, that's none of your business. That is none of your business. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that caused him to be born blind? To be honest with you, I'm not sure who really was blind at that point. The man or the disciples? The man who couldn't see, or let's just call it for what it is, the church. Well, Jesus confronted that faulty thinking as he responded to his disciples. He says to them, you're asking me the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no such cause effect here. Look instead for what God can do. These were the followers of Christ. That should have been their first reaction. What can God do in this situation? But instead, they look for someone else to blame. Jesus said, we need to be energetically at work for the one who sent me here, working while the sun shines. When night falls, the workday's over. For as long as I'm in the world, there's plenty of light. I am the world's light. In other words, Jesus is saying to his disciples, you need to open your eyes to really see what's happening and what was about to happen. Scripture tells us Jesus spit in the dust. He made some clay eyes, and he told the man to go to this pool of Siloam, which means sent. And with that, the man's eyes were healed. Now, let me just give you the Cliff's Notes version of the rest of the story, what Paul Harvey calls the rest of the story. People recognized this was the man who used to sit and beg because he was blind, told a few people what happened. Of course, word gets back to the religious officials, as it always did. And as we can guess, they weren't happy. They were so blinded by their own power and their own ego that they couldn't recognize, rather they wouldn't recognize God's presence and power as it stood right in front of them. Instead, they were angry about the fact that this man had been healed on the Sabbath. How dare you do something good on God's day, they said. It's not in your version, but that's what happened. You get the irony there? I mean, isn't that pray for? that people's lives would be changed and that people would be healed from whatever their condition is, especially from their sinful condition. And if it happens when we're together to worship on the Sabbath, even better. But when it happened, the church didn't like it. Why? Because it didn't fit in to their understanding. It didn't fit into their preconceived ideas of how healing was supposed to take place. And worse, because Jesus didn't fit into their nice, neat little idea of what a healer, namely this Messiah, was supposed to be like, then they didn't like it. And so they called for the man and they asked him what happened. And he told them a bunch of times. Read through that story this afternoon. He tells them a bunch of times what happens. In fact, there's a point at which he says, look, I've told you this over and over again. Why do you keep asking me? Finally, they said, well, you tell us about this Jesus. Give us your opinion of who he is, what he is. The man said, well, he's a prophet. Well, they weren't going to have that. They didn't like that business. So they came up with another explanation. He must not have really been blind. He had to have at least been able to see. I remember as a kid, there was a lady in our church who I'd been told all my life was blind. Okay, whatever. We went to Worlds of Fun, which is a large amusement park, much like Six Flags, Darien Lake, kind of like that. I remember as about a 9 or 10-year-old being in line to ride the octopus. The octopus is one of those things that goes up and down, spins you around, and all this kind of stuff. And you sit in this car, and you have to step up on these steps, and then they pull the steps up, and then it takes you on the ride. And I was waiting on riding the octopus, and I saw this lady from our church who was blind run to the octopus, step up on the steps, and sit down. And I went, one or two things happened. Either she was just healed in line, or she could see, at least somewhat. The next week, she was at church as normal. Kind of get the idea. That's what the religious officials are doing here. Well, if we can't explain away his healing, let's explain away the fact that his condition, he never really was blind. And so they said, okay, we're going to call his parents in. Maybe they'll confirm our story that he's not really blind. So they called him in. Was he really blind? They said, and Scripture says his parents said to them, we know he's our son, and we know that he was born blind. We don't know how he came to see. We don't have a clue about who opened his eyes. Why don't you ask him? He's a grown man. He can speak for himself. And then I love this parenthetical statement that we have in Scripture. Scripture tells us his parents were talking like this because they were intimidated by the rather than celebrating the fact that their son that they knew had been born blind, had been blind for at least a couple to 3 decades, now he can see. He's been able to look them in the face for the first time and see what they look like. Rather than celebrate that, they're intimidated by the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who took a stand that this was the Messiah would be kicked out of the meeting place. That's why his parents said, I don't know, ask him, he's a grown man. In other words, we're not taking responsibility for him. Well, that didn't satisfy the religious officials either. So they called the man back in. Okay, tell us again. And he said, look, I've already told you a couple times what happened. All I know is that this morning when I got up out of bed, I couldn't see, and now I can. I was blind, now I see. Conversation goes back and forth. The religious officials till they finally kicked him out of the building, and news of that spread to Jesus. And so Jesus comes back looking for the man, which I love that. Jesus coming back. When this man was rejected by the religious officials, when the man was rejected by the church, who comes after him? Jesus. And he asked him, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man said, point him out to me and I'll believe. And Jesus asked this question. I love this. Don't you recognize my voice? And at that point, even though the man's eyes had already been opened, now he could see. Jesus then said, I came into the world to bring everything into the clear light of day, making all the distinctions clear, so that those who have never seen will see, and those who have made a great pretense of seeing will be exposed as blind. Well, some Pharisees, Scripture says, overheard him and said, does that mean you're calling us blind? Jesus said, if you were really blind, you'd be blameless. But since you claim to see everything so well, you are accountable for every fault and every failure.